Welcome back to the Vires and Numeris Podcast, episode number 48 with law scholar, former law professor, physicist, libertarian theorist, author / novelist, anarchist-anachronist-economist, David D. Friedman. Welcome to the show today, sir.
Thank you. I really don't think it's fair to call me a physicist because I got a doctorate in physics 50-some years ago, was a postdoc for a few years and then switched to economics, and I really haven't done physics since then. So,
okay, fair rebuke. So let's start. I like to start in the beginning of everyone's life, and you had a very interesting childhood. Obviously, your dad was a Nobel Prize winning economist, and your mother was also an economist, Rose Friedman. Your dad won the Nobel Prize in 1976. So my question is, to lead off here, what was it like growing up with two parents that were economists? And did they sort of, when did you realize that was sort of a different thing? And when did you realize that maybe they were teaching you little things along the way in life to give you economic lessons? Was that something that you picked up on very early, or was it very, this is economics, we're teaching you this, or was it subtle?
I don't think we put it in terms of teaching economics. It was just talking about ideas. And I spent a lot of time arguing with my father about many different things, which was fun. I guess I suppose by the time I was in high school, it was reasonably clear that not everybody in the world agreed with us. But it's sort of, I guess what strikes me about being brought up really wasn't about economics. It was the idea that what mattered was whether your arguments were right, not how old you were.
Okay.
And the way I like to put it is that there are really two theories of children. One of them is that small children especially, one of them is they're pets who can talk, and the other is that they are small people who don't yet know very much. And my parents certainly believed in the latter theory. One of the incidents I remember, my mother's parents lived in Portland, Oregon, and we were in Chicago. And at some point when I don't know how I was old, I was maybe 12 or something, we took a train across the country. This was back before airplanes were as inexpensive and convenient as they now are. And it was, I think, 2 nights and 3 days, as I remember. And you could have a berth, but it was expensive. And so my father offered me and my sister the choice. We could either have a berth, or we could not have a berth and have the amount of money available to us that would have cost. And of course, both of us chose the money. And that struck me as an interesting example of sort of applying a generally libertarian approach. Now, thinking about it as an economist, it's not an entirely accurate example, because to some extent, if we didn't get enough sleep, we might be cranky, which might make things more unpleasant for my parents. So it wasn't a pure private good, but nonetheless, it was close to one. And so it seemed a reasonable way of treating it.
That's a good story. I appreciate that. So your dad your father didn't consider himself as an ANCAP. I know that.
No.
At what age did you start to get that sort of feeling that you
That's
were
an interesting question. Let me try. I can remember the sequence, but not the timing very well. I think my view, I guess in a way, the central question at that point was really the ethical question, not the economic one. Namely, did Congress passing a law give any moral obligation to obey it? And I couldn't see any reason why it did. But at the same time, my view, and I'm thinking now of me at about 15 or 16, something probably maybe even younger than that, was that if people didn't feel obliged to obey the law, then the society would break down. You couldn't have enough police to enforce it. Therefore, I decided that I would act as if I was obliged to obey the law until I could figure out what the answer to that puzzle was. And I eventually noticed that everybody else thought that was sort of odd. That is to say that the people around me did not act as if they believed they were obliged to obey the law, that people quite routinely drank alcohol when it was illegally young. They drove a little over the speed limit, various minor infractions. And so I concluded that I had been wrong, that what you needed for a society to function was an adequate mix of law enforcement and people agreeing with the laws. And that was what really did it. So therefore, I concluded that morally, in a moral sense, I was an anarchist. That is, I didn't think that the government had any moral authority. And the point at which I concluded that there was no need for government, but the problem is I can't date it, but probably when I was in college, I went to college when I was 16, was when I read Heinlein's book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And I could get some limit on that because by finding out when it was published, I don't remember. But what Heinlein, the thing is, I thought that I had a proof, not an explicitly written out proof, but a sort of an intuitive proof in my head, that although the free market was the right way of handling everything inside a society with law, that the framework itself had to be produced by something else, the framework of law and law enforcement. And if you have a proof, it should always apply. And what Heinlein did in that book was to give what seemed to me was a believable, internally consistent picture of a society where law and law enforcement were private and decentralized. And now it wasn't anything like my society, so it didn't prove you could do it in my society. But if I was willing to accept his fictional version as evidence in the sense of a consistent story, then it couldn't be true that doing it was in general impossible. And that meant it was an interesting question to see how you would do it in our society. And that's really what the ideas in my first book, Machinery of Freedom, came out of, that I was trying to say, all right, in my society, how would you do it? Now, many, many years later, when I knew more about other historical societies, I concluded that what I had really been doing was reinventing the wheel, because what I was doing in that book was constructing a conjectural set of institutions which represented a modern high division of labor version of something that had existed in a variety of past societies. So if my most recent nonfiction book is Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. And I have there a fairly detailed description of the traditional Somali system, which was a stateless system, which in some ways looks rather like what I constructed, except on a much less fancy society. And I discuss Saga period Iceland, which was not quite anarchist because there was a law code and a legislature, but there was no executive arm of government. All enforcement was private. And I have a chapter on what I refer to as feud law, which is a sort of a general description of how private decentralized law works. And it looks as though that's been a large part of the law for quite substantial areas in time. I've got an interesting quote about what was actually happening in the Middle Ages, for example, for that chapter. So now let's see, Machinery was published in 1971, when I would have been about 26. And so being written for a year or two before that, so I would guess that I had the ideas worked out at some point in my early 20s, probably just after I was graduating from college. But I'd have to find things I wrote and date them, as it were, to get you anything more accurate.
No, that's a great explanation. I appreciate that. I wrote a couple short books about Bitcoin and how I view it as a gateway to maybe that private law society. I'm glad I didn't get too far into your work then, because I wanted to have those original ideas. But I want to ask you more about that here in a second. You brought up becoming maybe developing this ANCAP philosophy, or whatever you want to call it, at university. I was around 21 probably when I started thinking about these things more seriously, and a few years ago now. But I'm wondering, like, what kind of pushback did you get? Did you start writing about these ideas at your university at the time? And I know you went to
I think the earliest point at which I was writing about them that I can when I was a freshman at college, one of the things I did was to write 1- and 2-page essays and tape them to the inside wall of the freshman union and stand around arguing with people. But though I don't think any of those were specifically on the anarchist position. They were on various sort of pro-market and to some extent conservative positions at the time. I was at Harvard, where that was not the normal position, which made it fun. And at some point, but I could probably find out when, but I don't remember when, I started writing a regular column for a conservative student magazine called The New Guard, which was the magazine of Young Americans for Freedom.
Okay.
And actually, I think the first president of the AF may have been an anarchist. I think Bob Schuckman was the first president. But in any case, it was much more conservative. But that was a point at which conservative really included both libertarian and traditionalist pretty explicitly. Yeah. And I was the token libertarian on that journal. So my column was called The Radical. And I'm reasonably sure that at some point in those columns, I sketched out some of the ideas for market anarchy. But I'd have to go back. It's a long time ago, and I have to go back and look at them and figure out exactly when. And my guess is that was either towards the end of my being an undergraduate or maybe early in being a graduate student. But okay. Somewhere online, I bet there's the information by which I could figure out when my first one of those columns was published.
Well, now that I have a little bit more information, maybe I could do that digging. I've done a lot of digging over the last week. So I'm curious, as sort of a follow-up on universities, and then we'll move on to another topic. I think you most recently taught at Santa Clara, and I don't know if that ended, you stopped teaching there in 2017, is that correct?
Sounds about right. I don't know, maybe 2018. I've been retired for a few years.
Okay. My question is, with what we know about like universities today, I feel like they've been co-opted to a large degree. And as you kind of noted, that our ideas aren't exactly as welcomed.
I didn't have any real problem there. That is to say, certainly it was not I like to say that the university I was at had two implicit ideologies. Okay. One of them was soft leftism, and one of them was Catholicism. It was a Catholic university. I didn't agree with either of them, and it was never a problem. That at the point when I was interviewed by them, before I was hired, I was interviewed by somebody who was, I think, the number 2 person at the university, Jesuit. And I'd been told that he was a believer in liberation theology. And I certainly made no pretense of what my views were, and did not seem to be any problem at all. As far as I could tell, he wanted to know whether I'd be an interesting person to teach students there, not whether I agreed with him. And I was told he was one of the people who recommended hiring me, Father Privet. But I think that was true throughout, that at one point, the university devoted a week to sustainability. And they sent out an email to professors saying, would you like to give a talk on or teach a class on sustainability? And I emailed back, do you mind if I give a talk against sustainability? And the answer was, no, we don't mind. And I gave the talk. Almost nobody came, but I didn't get any hostility from it. And certainly, I guess my views were reasonably obvious. Of my colleagues, there was at least one other who I think thought of herself as a libertarian, not an anarchist. And I would have said several others who were to varying degrees sympathetic with the position. It would probably have been less comfortable if I'd really been a conservative rather than a libertarian, but I'm not sure. But no, I would have said that on the whole, SCU, Santa Clara University, where I taught, was a pretty tolerant environment. There was, in fact, I think after I had left, some kind of a flap where the student government refused to authorize a student club that was conservative, and the administration told them they can't. Basically, that they don't have that option. So I would have said, my picture of Catholic education is pretty positive on that basis. That the Jesuits have, a long history of being interested in ideas. They're sort of the Catholic intellectuals. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Jesuits, the Order of Jesus, is the only organization I know of that's risen from the dead. Because as you may know, it was abolished by the Pope, maybe early 18th century or something, and then eventually came back. Which I thought was sort of neat. Yeah. There was one Jesuit in the college, and very nice man, no longer alive, unfortunately. And whenever we had bad weather, I would drop into his office and tell him that I felt that the South Bay was in violation of its warranty. That after all, a warranty can be established by repeated dealings. If your products have certain characteristics, people can expect them to be. And that I felt that since he was the representative of the responsible agent, I had to warn him we might have to go to law and sue to do that. And the weather always got better, so it worked. but he didn't seem to mind that. Yeah. He was a nice man. But so no, I would say my impression is, but my daughter's experience at Oberlin was that the students were much more intolerant than the faculty. That I can't remember the details, but there was some incident in one of her classes where a professor said something which simply took it for granted that everybody in the class agreed with his political position. And she pointed out to him afterwards and he apologized. It hadn't occurred to him.
Right. Yeah, it sort of seems like that might be kind of common.
So I think, I'm sure there are professors who are not only leftist, but intolerantly leftist. But I think there are a substantial number who aren't. Whereas at least at Oberlin, the student, I think her perception was that the view of the students was, if you didn't agree with the conventional leftist views, you were either evil or stupid. And which is an unfortunate situation. I really haven't had, maybe I just have a thick skin, but I through my history teaching at various universities, I've really never had the feeling that people thought I was crazy or evil because I had unconventional views.
That's interesting. I've ran into more pushback, I guess, in my time. Maybe I'm not as eloquent as you in my debate. I don't know. Maybe I need to work on that. But what I want to talk about Machinery, your book. It's classic. It's one of the top anarcho-capitalist books ever written, Machinery of Freedom. Can you water down, we don't have a ton of time today and I have a lot of questions, but can you water down like how we can get to a decentralized, privatized...
That's really two different questions. One of them is what the society would look like and the other is how you get there. And I am not a revolutionary. One of the things I disagree with Rothbard about, not a very fundamental thing, is the idea that if you could abolish the government by pushing a button, you'd push the button, because I think the results would not be very pretty. I think that the way you get there is by gradually reducing the size of government, developing alternative institutions. The particular version of that that's happening most strikingly at the moment is in education. That one result of COVID has been a whole lot of people shifting away from the public schools because the public schools have been largely closed. And some of that is to private schools, some of it is to homeschooling, some of it is to private institutions sort of between schools and homeschooling where you've got groups of kids getting together. And I think if enough of that sort of thing happens, that then it becomes very much easier to eventually abolish the public school system. And similarly, the more people are dependent on private institutions for prevention against crime, the less they are going to be willing to tolerate governments doing things which are supposed to do that, and so forth more generally. So I think the appropriate policy is, on the one hand, to spread ideas so people see statelessness as eventually as an option, but more than that, to just build alternative institutions, reduce the size and power of government, and so forth. So in that sense, it's a pretty conventional conservative, or at least pre-Trump conservative version of policy. But in terms of how it would work, the system that I imagine is one in which private individuals are the customers of firms. The firms sell the service of protecting your rights and settling your disputes. That's a pretty straightforward arrangement. Then the obvious problem people raise is what happens when I'm the customer of one firm, you're the customer of another. I think you violated my rights. You claim you haven't. Do we just start fighting? And I think the answer is that it's pretty clearly in the interest of the firms to set up a peaceful solution to that problem because they know it's going to occur. And the obvious solution is they agree in advance on a private court. So you then have private firms which agree to settle such disputes. And that what enforces the agreement is the fact that they're all repeat players, that my firm knows that if, when the court rules in favor of you, they ignore that ruling, then the same thing will happen the other way when it rules in favor of them. Then they've got no peaceful way of settling the dispute. So it's in both firms' interest to go along with the court decisions and to say, all right, the court says you stole my television set, therefore your firm won't protect you when my people come to retrieve the set, or will insist on your paying compensation, or whatever the court rules. So that's the basic system. And there are a number of problems with it. One problem is how do you produce public goods, which the most important one is defense of your territory against other nations. And I've discussed a number of imperfect ways of doing that. What kind of law comes out of that? And what I'm describing is, in effect, a competitive market for generating legal rules, because the arbitration agencies, the private courts, want to be hired. The rights enforcement agencies that are hiring them want to have legal rules their customers like, because that makes it easier to get customers. So you therefore have a market pressure to generate legal rules that are the legal rules that people are happy with. It's not a perfect system. There are no perfect systems in the world, but I think it's likely to give you a much better set of legal rules than the system we now have. So that's the basic sketch of it. And all of that is in the first edition of Machinery. Second edition added some additional material, and second edition you can read for free from my webpage. The third edition added another 100 pages of material, part of which is thinking through more carefully some of what was in the first edition, and part of which is new material. So I guess that would be my simple sketch. But as I said, the second edition you can read for free, and the third edition is, I don't know, maybe a $5 Kindle or something like that. I try to make my books cheap.
Okay, so one question I have with this is like something that I've been thinking about, because I think about these ideas nonstop. This is like something super interesting to me. I love thinking about how we could, get this private law society. What happens in the case of the two competing agencies can't come to terms on an arbiter or arbitration? An agency, a firm that is the one in the middle that would these two agencies would go up to this arbiter.
But firms that are consistently unable to do that go out of business because they are providing a more expensive and lower quality service than firms they can agree to. That is I think you don't want to think about it as choosing an arbitrator after a dispute arises. You want to think about it as a long-term agreement where we say, look, some of the cases your guy will be in the wrong, some of the cases my guy will be in the wrong. I want to protect my people's rights, but I don't particularly care very much about protecting my people's ability to violate your rights. That's not worth very much. So therefore, we will agree on an agency in advance. But I could imagine system breaking down if people feel strongly enough, and maybe they fight each other. That happens in our system too. But I think it's less likely.
Okay, great. That was a great answer. Okay, so I think about Bitcoin as this vehicle to, let's shift topics. I know I've heard you talk about Bitcoin quite a bit, actually. I'm curious, I view it as like a vehicle to freedom, the idea that those who control the money control the world. I don't know who said that. One of the Rothschilds or something, I think a long time ago, I think has attributed that quote, but I can't remember who it was. So do you view Bitcoin as this sort of vehicle that we could use to help? It seems like to me that this is going to be an obvious sequence of events.
Well, except that Bitcoin is really not a very good money in a variety of ways. I think the idea of cryptocurrencies gives you a interesting way around the present monetary kind of system. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin certainly has some use, but I think Bitcoin's use at present is much more for being able to make moderately anonymous transactions online than it is for substituting for the main purposes of money. And whether we will eventually develop, that's what you really want, is a cryptocurrency which is easy to use and has reasonably predictable value. Stable coin is the term people use for that idea. And there are a variety of ways you could do it. I've discussed on my blog my scheme for how you could make one that was stabilized against the dollar or against some other, whatever variable you want, and other people have other ideas. So I don't think Bitcoin itself is likely to replace existing monies, although it's certainly a useful thing. But it's possible that some future cryptocurrency will. I have a old article called A World of Strong Privacy. I don't know if you found it, but it's on my webpage. And it was one in which I was exploring the ways in which encryption made possible essentially an anarchist society online. That one of them is anonymous digital currency. I think I wrote that long before Bitcoin. And I was there. There's a scheme for anonymous digital currency that the Dutch cryptographer David Chaum came up with a long time ago. That's what I was imagining. And the problem with Chaumian digital cash, its advantage over Bitcoin is it's actually anonymous, and Bitcoin is not really anonymous. It's just harder to know. But Chaumian digital cash requires an issuer. It requires a bank somewhere, which can actually, at some point, you bring in your digital cash and they give you dollars or whatever it's denominated in. And the issuer has got to be a trusted firm in an environment with reasonably stable laws and so forth. But all of those environments are modern developed societies which disapprove of anonymous digital currency, because if you have anonymous digital currency, money laundering laws become unenforceable. And it's not an absurd worry. That is, I've discussed, certainly in my book, Future Imperfect, maybe in that essay, I don't remember, the downside of all of this. That, for example, one of the real problems with kidnapping is how do you collect the ransom money without getting caught? Well, that problem disappears once you have an anonymous digital cash, as we've seen with ransomware, which came out of having digital cash available. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, these changes are good in some ways, bad in other ways. I think on net they're good, but I can understand why if you tried to set up a bank in the U.S. or even in Switzerland that was issuing anonymous digital cash, you might find that the government that you were under told you shut you down again. Didn't like it. And I think that's why Chaumian digital cash never appeared, although the mathematics were worked out a very long time ago. And the neat thing about Bitcoin is you can't shut it down that way. It doesn't depend on an issuer. It has disadvantages as well, but it has that substantial advantage. So anyway, so no, I think Bitcoin is a good thing, but I don't think that it's going to end government's control over money, and I don't think ending government's control over money would end government. That after all, in Scotland had a government in the 18th century, and they were using privately issued banknotes. And if you look back during the Middle Ages, I don't know if there were any important private monies, but a lot of the money that circulated wasn't the money of the place it was circulating. That the Byzantine, the Byzant, the numisma was an international money. So was the dinar, the Islamic gold money. So that, the issuing societies got a certain amount of status out of that, but it wasn't as if they could control things. There is actually a medieval Islamic story, which has to do with that. It's basically a story where the Byzantines were doing something. The Muslims were producing in Egypt paper that had Greek writing at the top of it, mm-hmm. which was being used for documents by the Byzantine Empire. This was a international market. And the Caliph had one of his scholars translate the writings. And he discovered they were blasphemous, which probably means they referred to the Trinity, because Muslims believe that there's only one God, and therefore Christians are splitters. Mm-hmm. So he gave order that it should stop. Right. And the Byzantine emperor was terribly upset about this, because the Byzantine Empire had a very large bureaucracy, and how could they do their bureaucracy without the official paper and so forth? So he asks the Caliph to change his mind, and the Caliph says no. And eventually the Byzantine emperor comes with a threat. His threat is, that throughout your lands, the money that circulates is our money, the Byzant. Therefore, we will have our money minted with formulas on it cursing the prophet that will make your hair stand up on your head to read it if you don't agree to help to do what we want in this very small matter. And so the Caliph calls his advisors around, and what he ends up solving this problem is by minting his own coins, by calling in the circulating gold currency and reminting it with Islamic formulas on it, which there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet on each side of it. And that's the origin of the dinar. I don't know if it's historically true or not, but I got it out of an economic history book, and it was at least a medieval story of the origins. That was the case in which they were trying to use the money for sort of to exert power, but it didn't work.
That's actually the Byzantine generals problem is actually a major computer science problem. So you learn a lot from that time frame, I guess. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is, do you view since fungibility is one of the main characteristics of good money? I think you probably agree with that. Would you view a private cryptocurrency better off than Bitcoin because of the lack of fungibility of Bitcoin?
As I would have said, it would be better. A currency would be better off if it was easily transacted in, and if its future value was easy to predict. Because one of the things you'd like to use your currency, you'd like to be able to set prices for your goods, and you don't want to have to revise them every 3 days.
Right.
And so, in that sense, it's not a very convenient currency in a bunch of ways. Anyway, but yeah, I don't really follow the crypto world very carefully. I actually have some Bitcoin and some Ether, which I got under very, not really as a speculation. I have the Ether because I gave talks in Budapest, which is where a bunch of the Ether people are, and they paid me for my talks in Ether. And I assume if I work it out, those were very well paid talks because that was a while ago. And I have Bitcoin because I gave a talk at PorcFest, which is the Free State Project summer event in New Hampshire, which I enjoy. I've been to it a number of times. Probably will go to it again this summer. And they agreed to pay me my expenses. They weren't even paying me a speaker's fee. And so just for fun, I had them pay me my expenses in Bitcoin. And I figure that's by a large margin my best paid talk. I think they paid me roughly 1 Bitcoin, as I remember. So that means that one talk got me, if I liquidated it, about $50,000, which is a great deal. But that wasn't why I got it. I just got it because I thought it would be fun.
I actually watched you debate Bob Murphy at PorcFest one time on YouTube. So
yeah, I don't think that was the same one, but I'm not sure.
Okay, I think that one is the one I watched. I just watched it again recently. I watched it a few times. It was in 2013, I think. So my next question is about. It's also blockchain related, but this one is a Bitcoin question. I view I know you say you don't keep up with it a ton, but you have written on it and you do understand it quite a bit. Smart contracts. Do you view programmable smart contracts as a way to set up
smart contracts were being discussed long before Bitcoin, as you may know.
Right.
The fairly old idea in the very small niche of sort of computer libertarian types.
Right.
But smart contracts are a neat idea. My understanding is that Ether is better designed for that than Bitcoin, because as I understand it, you can use Ethereum to essentially write your contracts in. And I had one of my talks in Budapest, I gave a talk in Graz, Austria, I think the day before. And some of the people at the talk in Graz were some of the Budapest people. And so they gave me a ride, which took a couple of hours from Graz to Budapest. So I spent a couple of hours talking with Ethereum people about Ether, and that was very neat. And in particular, the hard problem for doing that is how the software finds out what's happened in the real world. So if you imagine that I have a contract with you where I agree that if X happens, I'll pay you money, a bet, say, how does the software find out what happened? And they have an ingenious solution, which might even work. I'm not sure what they call it, shelling Oracle for doing that. And you can think of other ways of doing it. But I think from the standpoint of making smart contracts work, that's the only hard part of it is how does the software find out what's happened in the real world.
That's one of the things I'm most interested in is the Oracle solution. Chainlink Labs is working on it, how to get the inputs and outputs to mesh with real-time, real-world events. So yeah, but no, I think smart contracts are a very, very clever idea, and it may actually work. We'll see. I appreciate that answer. Your dad also talked about eCash as well. I'm just curious, real quick, if you ever spoke with him in any sort of length about
I'm probably the source of whatever he said about eCash. I think that was my interest in his, if I remember correctly, though he may have also seen other things about it. But again, that was long pre-Bitcoin. That was that what I think he was talking about, as I was talking about, was really Xiaomi and digital cash or something similar. So I can't say we predicted Bitcoin. Bitcoin was a very clever idea that came out of nowhere.
Well, it's still very a visionary. Yeah, what you had, what you put in his ear apparently was a visionary idea. I mean, it still wasn't.
What we were interested, what I was interested in really was the implications. That is, that if you had that my world of strong privacy, if you have public key encryption widely being used, you then have a world where anybody can talk to anybody without third parties observing it, or at least very, very difficult for third parties to observe it. That's one part of it. Second, you can use digital signature so that you can have an identity online without having to reveal anything about your real space identity. So, for example, I've sketched out I don't know if it's in the original article, but it's at least in Future Imperfect, the way I could set up giving legal advice, even though I'm not a member of the bar, and therefore legally can't sell legal advice, by doing it online, proving who I am using a digital signature, giving some free legal advice for a while, and after people find out it's good, I get a reputation, I can sell. Now, I'm not going to do that because I'm not competent, in fact, to do that. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an economist who applies economics to the law. But I could, as far as given that world. So if you have a world with widespread use of public key encryption, you can have everything online happening invisibly to the state, invisibly to anybody except the parties. And I discuss ways in which you enforce contracts in that world. My ways are simpler than the smart contract. I'm using an arbitrator, but the parties agree on the arbitrator in advance, and then I'm using reputational enforcement rather than physical enforcement. But as far as I can tell, all of that is in principle doable, and that's very interesting to me because it suggests that you might have, in the not very distant future, a world which is anarcho-capitalist online and with government still in control in real space. And if a lot of human activity happens online, then not only is a large part of your life happening without the state, but the states are constrained by the potential for migration, because the more of your life is happening online, the less the cost to you of moving. And the lower the cost to you of moving, the more states become landlords rather than rulers. So that's sort of I don't actually expect to see a full-scale anarcho-capitalist society in my lifetime, unless they solve the aging problem, which would be nice, but assuming they don't. But I could imagine, I think we're already seeing elements of what I'm describing happening with people more mobile because more of their both business and social life is online, and with the parts that are online, very hard for government to control.
You sound optimistic. I'm optimistic too. Did you have debates with your father and mother about economics? I'm kind of curious because it's just something I'm interested in. I'm curious if you had many.
I wouldn't have argued with my mother was much less active. That is, mother certainly played a sizable role in what my father was doing. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the conversation, mother's line was that when she married my father, she lost half her conversation. And when I was born, when I learned to talk, she lost the other half. And I think that's an exaggeration, but it's certainly true that much more of the talking between me and my father, and she was mostly out of it. We argued about lots of things. I'm not sure we argued about anything very fundamental, but arguing is fun. It's a way of working through ideas and such. Somebody I knew in college had met someone who met us probably when I was in high school skiing in Colorado. And his story was we spent all our time arguing and I won half the arguments. And that's not true. I don't think my score was ever as high as 0.5, but we certainly spent a lot of time arguing, and that was fun. But I wouldn't say we really argued about the anarchy issue. That was really much more a difference in interests. That what my father was interested in was, in the world as it is, how can we make it better? And what I was interested in was, if you carry these principles all the way, what do you get? Right. And so his view was that my system of anarchy might work, but probably wouldn't. And my view was it might not work, but probably would. I have especially in the third edition, I have a discussion of ways in which it could break down. There are basically three problems with the system. One of them is producing very important public goods, where national defense is the obvious example. And I discuss various imperfect ways you might do it, but that's going to depend on how strong your enemies are, how patriotic your population is, a bunch of things of that sort. Second problem is internal breakdown, which I think of as cartelization, that what happens if the enforcement agencies get together and they say, look, we'd have life much easier if we agreed that we wouldn't accept your customers and you wouldn't accept ours. We now each have a monopoly. We can raise our prices. And whether that's workable is going to depend largely on how many of them there are, because it's fairly easy to work out a cartel with 3 firms, very hard with 100 firms. And then the final problem, which really isn't going to break it down, but is a disadvantage, is what I refer to as market failure on the market for law. And that's situations where the legal rule between me and you affects him. And in that situation, since that legal rule is being basically determined by what we want going through our agencies, we'll ignore the costs or benefit to the third parties. And in some cases, you'll get from an economist standpoint, the wrong legal rule out of that. But I don't really think of that as a way in which the system collapses. It's a way in which the system is imperfect. But since the alternative system, the political system, does a much worse job of generating laws, I don't see that as a serious argument against anarchy.
I love that. Yeah, I think you know who I agree with more on this topic, but I'm curious. I'm curious if you view are people who are more collectivist or leftist or whatever you want to call them, communist, are they bad logicians? Or does it take, do you need to be a good logician to be a good economist, basically?
Yeah, but you don't have to agree with me to be a good economist. There was a socialist economist, very prominent, Abel Lerner, who was part of the attempt to figure out how you could make socialism work by using economics. That is, what he really wanted was a system where, in effect, the communists were pretending to be capitalists. That the communist official running a factory was saying, if I were a profit-maximizing capitalist, what would I do? And figuring out that sort of a neat idea, market socialism. And I met him. He was an old man at the time, but I gave a talk, and it turned out that the person who asked an interesting question in the audience was Lerner. And I mentioned it to my father, and he said that Abel Lerner had a beautifully clear, logical mind, utterly uninterested in facts. So he was a good logician, and I'm sure he got it right. So no, I would say, I wouldn't say. I mean, I would have to say that some of the people on my side are pretty bad logicians. That, I mean, I just say the chapter I'm working on, I think I can demonstrate that Murray Rothbard said things that made no sense. And part of his handicap, of course, was that he was doing it by himself. That is, if you're part of the general economic conversation, if you're publishing articles in the American Economic Review or the JPE, and you say things that are wrong, people will point it out. But once you say, sorry, those people don't matter. All that matters is me and my 3 friends. Now it's much easier to make mistakes and not discover it.
That could be sort of a rebuke of Ayn Rand as well, right?
Oh, yes. No, Rand and Rothbard are very similar people in a bunch of ways. And in fact,
they ended up bumping heads, I believe.
Yeah, well, there wasn't room for 2 captains in one boat. But Rothbard starts out in his mire with Rand, and then they split fairly early. But it struck me, looking at this Austrian stuff, that a lot of what it's about is certainty. That the claim of the Austrian argument is that economic theory tells you things with certainty. So you don't have to look at the evidence. You don't have to do statistics and such. You already know the answers. Well, but that's also Rand's view. That Rand's view is that in her case, it's philosophy, but the philosophy tells you things with certainty. So how can you just dispute them? And they're wrong. And I went through in the debate a little bit, and I'm going through in the chapter I'm writing, how you could imagine factual circumstances in which what look like very strong implications of economics are wrong. That one of the things I didn't mention in the debate, I'm not sure if I'll put it into the chapter, I discussed the question of minimum wages. An economist would expect that increasing the minimum wage will reduce employment opportunities for the kind of people who get minimum wage, basically unskilled work. Mm-hmm. that expectation is strong enough that Jim Buchanan, who was a colleague of mine many years ago, once commented that all economists agree on that proposition. And that's not an empirical statement, that's a definition of economists. But he was wrong, because in fact, you can describe circumstances. My standard version involves a very implausible assumption of what people want, but not an impossible one, in which imposing a minimum wage increases the employment opportunities. And it turns out, the famous argument is by Card Kruger, but it turns out George Stigler made the same argument 40 years earlier, before they published. And that is, if you have a labor market, which is typically monopsonies, where there's a single firm that's hiring all the unskilled labor in an area, then the minimum wage can have the opposite effect, because a monopsony holds wages down by holding employment down, and therefore if they can't hold wages down, they'll hire more people. So what looks like a perfectly clear, sort of rigorous economic proof, once you think about it carefully enough, you say, no, it's a good reason to expect this to be true, but it's not a proof. Well, Rand, it seems to me, is doing the same thing, that I like to say that when Rand is making her argument, whenever there's a hole in the argument, you can tell, because she covers it up with beautiful rhetoric, with highly emotional rhetoric. But unfortunately, I have a chapter in Machinery, which is basically taking apart the central Rand argument from Atlas Shrugged. I haven't read a lot of her nonfiction stuff, but she goes through what claims to be a proof of her position, and there are holes in the argument. So no, I think in that sense they were very similar, and I disagree with both of them. Now, I admire Rand. She was brilliant and courageous, wrote very odd but very effective books. But I think my theory of Rand, I don't know much about Rothbard's background in that sense, is that Rand's problem was that she grew up in an environment where there was nobody as smart as she was. And in that environment, it's natural enough to conclude, if people disagree with me, it's just because they're stupid, they don't understand.
That was sort of,
I had the advantage of growing up in an environment where the other people were just as smart as I was.
That's interesting. So your view of the Austrian school is like of these sort of ideas and stuff. They're not apodictic or whatever, however you want to put it. That there are there's different. Not everything is black and white. That there are certain circumstances where things aren't going to be.
My view is that economic theory gives you good conjectures, but it doesn't give you conclusions with certainty, because the conclusions always depend on two things you don't know. Namely, what people's preferences are and what the technologies are. What are the ways in which you produce things? And for at least any example I've thought of, what looks like a strong economic argument, you can always think up some possible circumstance in which its conclusion would be wrong. And therefore, the right way to do economics is that you form your conjectures on the basis of the theory. This is what we expect to be true. And you then test them against the real world. And you might discover that your conclusion is wrong, and you might even figure out why it's wrong, or you might have better reasons to think it's right. So that seems to be the fundamental. Now, there are lots of differences in application.
Right.
I don't really know very much about macroeconomics. It's not my field. I know there's an Austrian business cycle theory. As far as I can I can see what seems to me a problem with that theory in terms of the theory, which is that it requires that people make the same mistake over and over again, and people are supposed to be rational. But I don't really know whether it does a better or worse job than some other versions. I don't think any version of macro works very well, as far as I can tell. And there are lots. I have a long list of things where I think Rothbard was wrong, but many of those aren't really Austrian. They're just Rothbard. They're just his particular interpretation of it. And many of them are things which some other Austrians would disagree with. But and I should say, I'm not even sure that my description of Austrianism is believing in knowing with certainty is true of Austrians, but it's clearly true of Rothbard. He was the person I was using for the purposes of the debate to define the position I was arguing against.
I've watched some Walter Block debates as well on the minimum wage and stuff. I haven't got to. I don't know if your debate with him that you had on Monday is uploaded.
It's up now.
Is it up now? Okay, I hadn't seen it yet, so I'm gonna probably watch that tonight.
Actually, yeah. I was thinking it's on YouTube, so YouTube has comments, so I may want to go up and comment on it. Yeah, I'm afraid I did not persuade Walter. Walter is a nice guy.
Yes.
But I think I've decided that maybe Rothbard is the mimetic virus, that he sort of fills up the mind and then makes it harder to think.
I know those two are pretty close friends. We only have, I'm mindful of time here. I have so many questions for you, but maybe I can have you back on again sometime if you're so generous with your time. Thank you. Can you talk about the issuance of money in your opinion, like in how this would go in this world? We don't want to call it a perfect world, but this world.
You don't even need anarcho-capitalism. You can have private money. It's perfect. It's existed in the past. It's perfectly straightforward. And you have private banks, and the banks issue either paper money or checking accounts, demand deposits. They define their money in terms of some unit that people care about. So the simple version would be gold or silver. I think there are probably better ways of doing it nowadays, but take that. What they say is, bring in our note and we will give you an ounce of silver. And then it's a fractional reserve system, because if they had to hold in their vault 1 ounce for every dollar issued or every ounce paper note issued, they wouldn't have no way of covering their costs, because they. But what they do instead is that they hold, let us say, 25% of the currency as a reserve, and the rest is in other assets. And then when somebody wants their silver, they come in, they give them their silver, and they sell some of their other assets and buy some more silver. So you can, in fact, redeem 100,000 ounces of silver when you only have 25,000. You don't always have to do it at the same instant. And that's the way those systems worked. Now, if you're worried about a run, one solution that some of the Scottish banks had was what was called the optional clause. And that was where the currency says 1 ounce of silver, redeemable on demand. But if we can't redeem it when you come in, we'll redeem it within a year and give you an extra 5% interest to pay for it. I don't remember what the numbers were, but it probably wasn't a 1 ounce. I don't know what the quantities were. So that's one way of protecting. But the only real worry in that system is, what if the assets are less than the liabilities, which is the worry when you're dealing with any firm at all, with any contracts. And the solution they had then was that the banks were unlimited liability partnerships, and one of the partners would be a wealthy man. So his assets are much larger than the bank's liabilities. So if something goes wrong, if the price of silver goes up relative to their other assets, they can still fulfill their contracts. And I could imagine in a modern world that one of the banks might be Apple or Microsoft or some firm which had very large assets, and therefore where it was clear that it was going to be able to fulfill its obligations, Google maybe, to fulfill its obligations whether or not things went badly. Now you would it would be moderately convenient if the different banks' monies were all convertible. So there will be some market pressure for them to all define them in the same units. They don't have to. It's less important now than it used to be. I like to say that the Europeans finally coordinated on a single currency just as it became unnecessary, because currency conversion is arithmetic. Computers do arithmetic fast and cheap. And as the world now is, that I can put my credit card into a money machine in London and draw pounds out of a dollar account. And it would be reasonably straightforward, I'm not sure if anybody's done it, to have a browser set up so that when it reads prices, it reads prices in whatever currency they're set in, but you see the prices in your currency. All it's got to do is check with the bank on what the current exchange rates are. So the importance of having a common currency, it's still convenient, but it's a good deal less convenient than it was 50 years ago. But my guess is that probably the banks would coordinate in order to make whoever really got going with this first, people would standardize on them. And the ideal reserve commodity is not silver or gold. The ideal reserve commodity is a market basket, is a collection of different commodities, so that you say, sorry, I don't redeem single Friedman dollars. I only redeem them $1 million at a time. Bring in $1 million Friedman dollars and you will get so much grade A steel, so much wheat, so much oil, whatever combination of goods, I'm reasonably sure will have a stable price. And that way you're not vulnerable to the risk that if for some reason the price of silver goes up a whole lot, now your money is worth much more. And now people who've got debts are going to have to pay them in much higher money, which was the problem, one of the problems with gold at one point. So I think that would be the ideal solution. On the other hand, it's much easier to agree on a single commodity. So it's probably more likely to be what would happen.
Right. Okay, last question, because I know you got to go. You got to get somewhere in a little bit. What is there a specific book? I'm really interested in like what you read. I know you're into science fiction. I read, and I know you're into medieval stuff. But could you give us maybe just a book on like anarcho-capitalism or something? Somebody maybe that you have admired their work or you've taken.
Yeah, I would say of my fellow anarcho-capitalists, the person I think most highly of is Mike Humer. He's a philosopher. And he's got a book. Now, I have to admit, I've only read the first half of the book. And the book is called The Problem of Political Authority. And the first half, he is going through all of the philosophical arguments for why governments have a right to do things that nobody else can do, and showing what's wrong with all of them. And it's a nice, careful discussion by a professional philosopher. And his basic conclusion is that the only defensible argument is if we don't do this, terrible things will happen. And he then spends the second half of the book, which I didn't bother to read, but probably should at some point, explaining why that isn't true, explaining basically what I was explaining in Machinery, why you can have a workable society without a government. And I should read it, but mostly I'm more interested in people talking about things I haven't already thought through than things I have. Right. But I think he's very good. He's bright. He's a good speaker. And you know, I have lots of reservations about Rothbard. I have reservations about Walter Block. He's a nice guy, but I don't think that he understands certain things very well. And Humer is the only sort of libertarian intellectual I can think of who I actually know, who I really don't have any reservations about from what I've seen of him.
We've talked about Rothbard quite a bit. Just one last quick question.
Yeah.
Did you ever engage with him? I don't know if there's any discourses that I've come across or anything like that.
Yeah, not very much. That is, there was one clash where he gave a talk, and I in the question period, I was pointing out what was wrong with what he had said, and he disagreed, and that ends up in something he wrote. When I originally was going to discuss that in something I was writing, I thought it was only in my memory, but it turned out that he had his own little journal at the time, and he discussed the episode there and made exactly the same bad arguments I thought that he had made live. But I would have said our two important disagreements I don't think we ever clashed on. And one of them would be the Austrian versus Chicago Agreed Economics. And the other would be the question of how you get a libertarian law code. Because as far as I can tell, what he was imagining was that the libertarian legal philosophers figure out what the law should be and then everybody does it. And I don't think that's a very plausible way of getting people to agree. You've got a whole bunch of different private arbitration firms. Mm-hmm. Why should they care what the libertarian philosophers say as opposed to what will make them money? Whereas my view is one in which there's a competitive market for law, in which the firms don't have to all agree. They may agree, they may not. And that market is then generating, roughly speaking, good law. So I think those are the two important disagreements. Maybe there's a third one, and that is there's an essay by Rothbard, which you can find online somewhere, on what's wrong with me. And he's right, except it's not wrong. That is to say, he says what's wrong with me is I don't hate the state. And that's true, that I think Rothbard thought of it as my opponents are evil people, and therefore I should hate them. And the trouble with that is that all's fair in love and war. And once you decide that people you're disagreeing with are evil people, you have no longer any obligation to be honest. And I think I can show evidence that he acted that way. Whereas my view is that the people who disagree with me are reasonable people who have come to what I think is an incorrect conclusion, and I hope to persuade them that they're wrong. And I think that's an important difference, but it's sort of a different kind of difference than the other three. But I don't think, aside from Rothbard having written that essay and my coming across it long after his death and writing my response, I don't think there's any. I actually met him a number of times, but we weren't. We were in different places and didn't have a whole lot of interaction.
Two titans nonetheless. I appreciate your time today, sir. Dr. David D. Friedman. Are there any links that you'd like to share? I know you mentioned your books and your
my webpage is daviddfriedman.com. You need the extra D because someone else got davidfriedman.com a few months before I did. And that has got a link to my blog where I put various things. It has links to the full text of several of my books and the full text of most of my articles, both academic and libertarian. So you can find, if you follow the links there, you can get access to a large fraction of what I've written. That's daviddfriedman.com. And among other things, my current writing project, which is going to take a long time, is converting about 15 years of blog posts into books. That is taking the ideas in those posts and sorting them by topic, and then within each topic, trying to find groups of posts that are really on the same general subject, and turning that into a chapter. I've got a link to that on my webpage, but I've been webbing the draft chapters as I finish a section. So I've got a section on libertarianism, which has some of my arguments with various libertarians and various other stuff. I've got a section on education. I have a section on religion. I've got a section on economics. I'm currently working on the section on climate. And of course, these are draft chapters, so they change. I plan to add another chapter to the economics one when I finish the chapter I'm writing about Austrian versus Chicago School, for example. But if you want to see what I've been doing recently, go to my webpage, find the link for that project, and you can find about a book's worth of unpublished stuff. But for most of my published articles, you can find links to it on the webpage.
I really appreciate your time. There's definitely got to be at least one follow-up interview because I'm very interested in what you have to say about a number of things. Climate was on the list. We just don't have time today. So
yes. All right.
Yeah. Hang on one second. I'll say a proper goodbye. Thank you.
Right.